Hi everyone. What I wanted to do today was basically just sort of talk through technically some of what's possible. So what are we even talking about when we're talking about Teams chats? Talk through the technical side first. So what are some things you technically could do inside 365? So firstly, just sort of from a scope perspective, I guess, one thing I should indicate is that within Teams, you have this concept of what Microsoft calls channel posts. And this screenshot is an example of that for any of you who are using Microsoft Teams at the moment. You go into a team, where you're working with your colleagues, and the posts are the things that appear in a channel, and you can reply to them. And I'm treating that as being kind of part and parcel of the scope of what we're talking about today. But technically, these are different, and they're actually stored in a different way in terms of the data in the background. So yeah, so those are channel posts, and then the other version of what's kind of more pure chat, I suppose, is this kind of a thing where you just jump into a chat, as in you basically select other people in the same organization as you, and then you just start talking to them, and you get this history of the conversation that you've had. And one thing I guess I want to point to there is like this here is a kind of a classic example of some of the features I see in terms of chat. So um, this person has sent 3 separate messages. They're very short. They don't have much context to them. Classic Petra today doesn't really tell me much. Who's Petra? What happened today? What do we need to help her with? What's Petra's relationship to us? What kind of work are we doing? Is this even a work thing? Like, does she need help with, I don't know, a baby shower or something? And as for LOL, is LOL a valuable record that I want to keep? Well, maybe, maybe not. And then we could get on to how outrageous it can get with, animated GIFs and memes and, just jokes, just everyone just kind of having a laugh in a chat context. So yeah, so today we're talking about both these kinds of chats and channel messages. Channel posts, which technically are kind of different, but I just think of them as the same. They're both mechanisms by which you can kind of instantly chat or communicate with someone else, and they're normally very short. So technically, there are actually a bunch of different options in terms of what you can do with chats. One thing is that you can actually configure a bunch of settings inside Microsoft 365 that would change what you allow people to do. And then second, Microsoft Purview, which is the kind of information governance and information management aspects of 365. Purview allows you to actually put controls around retention and disposition of chat, but in a really broad brush way. So not, in my opinion, a way that could ever comply with legislative requirements to identify particular types of records and sort of go, okay, we're going to manage these goodies to a different standard from the rest. I guess what I mean by that is that typically when we're thinking about managing records, we're managing them based on their value. We're managing them by aligning them to whatever you call it in your jurisdiction. You might call it something like a disposal schedule, the thing that gives you the authority to dispose. And you can't really do that. You can't really do that with chat in terms of technologies. So I'll go to those technical things first. So in terms of thinking about settings and so forth, next slide. So I took a screenshot here of when I'm configuring what's called a messaging policy inside the Teams admin center. And one of the things I can do in there is I can say, well, let's stop people from being able to delete their own messages. So if you felt that, look, chat's really valuable, kind of a record, and it might capture something of value about how we transact business, etc. You can do a bunch of things in here that you can see that could be seen as trying to protect a record from, unauthorized alteration or disposal. So, stop things from being deleted, stop kind of subsets of that. Like, so only the things that I've sent, I can't delete my own sent messages, or you can just stop people from deleting chat in general. You can also stop people from being able to edit their messages. So by default, you can actually edit your Teams messages. Don't know if you've done that, but you can. And then a really interesting thing I think there, just jumping down towards the bottom there, is you can actually turn off chat. So you can actually say, No, in my organization, this is just getting too hard for me. I'm not sure personally how that's going to fly from a business perspective. I really feel like the genie is out of the bottle and that people really enjoy using chat. And there's certainly a whole lot of conversation we could have around productivity and so on. Not really the focus for today, just more thinking from a sort of information and records perspective. You could just say, look, this is too hard. We're going to turn off chat like this. And I mean, being less sort of flippant about it, you could say, there's a whole lot of, sort of risk that we can't control in a better way apart from disabling chat. And a specific thing I should mention here is that I noted at the top of the slide, you can have multiple messaging policies, and policies apply to groups of users in your organization. So you could say, look, actually, there's certain parts of the organization where it's not appropriate that they could delete chat, for example, like the kinds of conversations that certain bits of the organization are having are ones that I'm worried about losing sort of valuable information from. And I mean, you can also just turn that on its head. You can say, right, across the organization, lock everything down, stop anyone from doing anything, except, I don't know, the CE because the CE's complained about it, let the CE just cut loose, or IT because IT took over from you. They get to do that. So yeah, so that's the admin center there. Sorry, the actual Teams admin center. And I was going to jump to Purview next, but I'll just double check if there's any messages or any, any comments. Anyone's there? I'm going to come back around to this. What I would say about this is if you can get the team admin access, then you can obviously get in there and change these things yourself. It doesn't require any other kind of administrative role. One of the things I really like in Microsoft 365 is that you can get there's heaps of what they call role groups within 365 that allow you to just access the bits that you need for your job. And I think it's quite appropriate for an informational records person to be able to get into the Teams admin center to do exactly these kinds of things. Sometimes your IT shop might disagree. So I'll move to the next one. This is looking at Purview. One thing I'll say about this is to get access to these features, this is the kind of stuff where you need basically the more expensive licensing plans. And so typically to get all of these features, you need what's called the E5 or Enterprise 5 license. So you basically need the more expensive Microsoft 365 licensing. Or there's a particular sort of upgrade you can pay for to just get the compliance aspects, which is what Microsoft Purview is all about. So what I've got there on the slide, where it says we've deleted older messages due to your org's retention policy, this is actually something that I just screenshotted from a live Teams instance that I use with one of my clients, where they've configured this to happen. And so what they've configured there, which is like the second bullet point here, is you can auto-delete Teams chats. So what this means is, let's pick 90 days. For whatever reason, that always sticks in my head. You could say, look, just nuke, nuke all the chat after 90 days from the period in which the message was sent. And so that's one of your options. The first option there above that one is you can do exactly the opposite. You can say, look, we're really worried about chat being lost, and so we want to retain it. And for either of these, the period can go up to, from memory, it's 10 years. So you could say, look, we actually want to keep everything that everyone's ever written. Anytime anyone wrote lol, anytime anyone posted a cat pic, whatever it is, keep all of it for a decade. If that's, if you thought that made, appropriate business sense in your organization. And you can do a combo. So you can say, look, we want to keep everything for that 10 years, and after 10 years, just nuke it, just let it go. So, set the clock ticking straight away from when people send stuff. And so over time, the information will be lost. And with each of those options, you cannot do that based on sort of selecting stuff based on value or based on context. You can only do it based on these bullet points at the bottom of the slide, based on who are the users that you're applying this rule to, or which teams are we talking about in terms of those channel posts. So, those teams might give you some kind of in if you're trying to go, okay, well, this is the team where we, I don't know, ratify council business or something, like local government work. And if that was true, then you might go, right, these chats are actually used in a very sort of, a relatively formal way, and we'll make sure that we keep that stuff. So, so there is some kind of way of sort of, trying to sort of map this to like, what are the things that we need to keep, what are the things that we want to look after. But it's really, really broad brush, and you're either going to keep too much, or potentially you risk destroying things that you wanted to keep. As per those last 2 points, you can kind of do what I call a whitelist or a blacklist. So you can say, all right, we're going to set a rule that says everything gets deleted after 90 days, but only for these particular users. Or you can do exactly the opposite. You can say everything gets deleted after 90 days unless you're, I don't know, the IT team or something, and you choose particular people. When it's specified users, that really is specified users. So it's not dynamic. You can't do it based on sort of someone's department according to Active Directory or something. You have to just name people. So a bit ugly, especially if you've got a large organisation.
Michael, there's a question in the chat from Xander,
Great.
if you want to have a look.
Okay, jumping in. Storage limits. I honestly don't know that one offhand, but as far as I know, I haven't bumped into it in my work. Like, no one said, hey, there's a practical limit here that you need to care about. So yeah, Microsoft's got really good public documentation about that kind of stuff. They're pretty average on the sort of contextual stuff that would make sense for us in Australasia, but in terms of stuff like how many bats can you keep, yeah, I could definitely check out their public documentation. One thing I'd say about all of this, well, like what actually happens. This is kind of like if you're used to the idea of a soft delete function in a document management system, where end users, depending on their settings, can just delete chats as far as they know, but it's actually all going into a mailbox in the background. So it's actually getting stored against the user's mailbox. So it's actually sitting in the Exchange server, but it's not accessible normally. So it's not accessible by end users, and it's not accessible by sort of the email admin either. So yeah, so it's kind of to me a slightly weird little setup where if an end user deletes stuff, or if a retention period is applied to stuff, it gets copied into people's mailbox. And if there's 10 of you in the chat, you all get the messages stored in your mailbox, which I think would be to minimize the risk when people leave. So you've still got stuff kept somewhere. If there is stuff that's still on hold when somebody leaves, it actually prevents that mailbox from being automatically deleted as well. It just gets stored in the server as inactive. So yeah, so I mean, there's heaps of detail I could go into here. I'm conscious of kind of overwhelming you with all of it. But sort of on that point of what you actually kind of do with this. So if you've applied a rule that says, okay, we want to keep some stuff, then you can use another feature inside Purview, which is called eDiscovery. And eDiscovery is anyone involved in legal? I don't know. But if you've worked in legal context, discovery is that process where you go and find all the evidence for an investigation or for an actual legal case. And so the eDiscovery tool inside Purview is an enterprise search, if you like. It searches all of Microsoft 365. It bypasses all of the permissions. So you can go and search the CE's mailbox. You can go and search, the OneDrive of, your boss or whatever, if you've got the access to eDiscovery Premium. So you have to be very, very careful about who gets access to eDiscovery. But eDiscovery is a really powerful tool for searching right across the system to try and identify potential sensitivities in terms of information. Obviously, to do actual investigations, like if there's potential fraud. Some organisations would use it in the context of like requests for personal information, or sort of, if you call them FOIs in your jurisdiction. I know every jurisdiction's got a kind of different name for that, but where you got a request for official information. And from there, you can obviously, as I'm saying on the slide there, you can find stuff. You can then pull it out if you need to. So, for instance, to give that to someone else. But you can also, if you've got premium, so again, this is the most expensive licensing, you can actually purge messages. So you could use this to selectively identify stuff that worried you and delete it. So yeah, so there's a bunch of options here. This one in particular, I think, is one that people haven't really explored. eDiscovery is typically thought of as being something that's kind of a sort of a fraud or workforce sort of integrity function or audit function or a legal function, not really sort of records or information management. I don't know, people on this call might have different experiences, but yeah, so there's a bunch of different options there. So just to summarize, basically you can apply a big rule over everything that says, look, we either want to make sure that we retain this stuff for a particular period of time, or we want to make sure that we delete this stuff automatically after a certain period of time. And you can do a combo deal with both of those. And while you've got those messages, you can use eDiscovery Premium to go and find them. So I think, yeah, that's about it from a kind of technical perspective, like what I wanted to kind of summarize there. Again, I'll just breathe. Nothing else in the chat. All right. So I guess then it's worth sort of going, well, okay, so that's what you can technically do. So I thought it was worth then sort of asking, well, what about kind of what you are either legally allowed to do or what you think, you're kind of compelled to do from a regulatory perspective. So I'll admit, I'm sitting here in New Zealand, so I will know most about the New Zealand context, but I've got also, clients across Australia as well, and thinking about concepts of that kind of official information idea. So freedom of information requests, RTIs, and I forget all the different names. But those kinds of things, typically chats would fall within the scope of what's expected of you. So if someone asks, do you have information about this topic? You're expected to find that stuff under this regulatory framework. Then in terms of like what you're allowed to do with it, you're supposed to be keeping these things or you're allowed to get rid of them. Definitely in New Zealand, I think there's a very, very clear authority to destroy these things whenever you want, where you have what's called General Disposal Authority 7 for anyone in New Zealand. It says you can chuck out transient, low-value conversation or internal communications whenever suits you. I believe this lines up really well with the NAP concept in several jurisdictions in Australia. So that kind of idea that under a normal administrative process, you can say, we're getting rid of this rather than having to put it through sort of formal disposition. So I would do whatever I could to try and determine the authority to destroy that. That's really where my head goes, because I think basically the alternative is that you're basically creating an ever-growing haystack, and people, when they ask for that needle, you've still got to go looking in that ever-growing haystack. So so I think there is real value in enabling that auto delete function. And I mean, I guess the third angle, definitely personal information and protection of personal information is a real hot topic. Often you do have some kind of an obligation to demonstrate that you're only keeping personal information for the purposes for which you collected it, that you're going to get rid of it if you no longer need it, those kinds of things. The existing technical tools that you've seen are pretty bad for that. They're not that useful. You could use eDiscovery eDiscovery Premium to go and find those things and try and purge them based on the existence of personal information. But I think that's actually really sticky. Like it's really hard to identify whether or not something contains personal information that needs to be disposed of, because it's not a question of just finding someone's name, right? It's about finding what is that sort of topic of that conversation and what information was shared in that context. So yeah, so it's a bit of a tricky one. So that's kind of regulatory context. So we've got a few things that you can do technically. In terms of kind of what you're able to do, my understanding in most jurisdictions would be that you could destroy stuff. You could say, look, this is just part of a routine process that we have. We've just turned on a thing that basically gets rid of records or low value information in a routine way. So I guess that leads us to kind of how do you decide? Like, how do you make a good decision about what you want to do with this? And I think there are several factors that you could bring into play here. And I think sorry, sorry, phone just went bananas on me just while I was in here. Excuse me. Got a scratchy throat. So yeah, like how do you make a decision about this? There's a lot of different things that you could think about in terms of like what makes sense. Um, I am really leaning towards this idea that unless there's really extreme circumstances, it's actually quite good hygiene to actually just enable one of those policies that allows for auto delete. So that's what's called a retention policy in Microsoft Purview. You can configure that for whatever period of time, and you can say, look, we are going to auto delete these messages. And that might sound really scary because we've moved into this world where suddenly there's more information being captured, as in it's it's recorded in the really literal sense. It's written down, and it can be tempting to say, well, once it's written down, we actually have this obligation to manage that to a certain standard, which is fair enough if it's of value, but I would dispute that for a lot of chat. So I guess, thinking about how do you decide, here's a bunch of possible factors. So as I say, I think that the vast majority of chat, in my experience, and I use it every day, but my experience is that almost all of it is of really low value. And what I would actually say about chat is that I consider chat to basically be incidental record keeping. So it's just people who have decided to communicate with each other things that would normally have been verbal. So would normally have just been the classic lean across your desk and ask your workmate, hey, how do I do this again? Or how did last night go anyway? Or, what are your kids up to? Or, what are you doing on the weekend? But I mean, also lots of work stuff, but still really, really low value. Um, and so, I think for me, considering the value of the information, of course, is absolutely important in deciding what I want to do with something. Like what do we do with records if we can't trace the value? Like this, it's just foundational to what we do. Then the second factor there's heaps of situations where you'll come to a chat, and anytime you've been away and you come back to a group chat and you see someone's comments, you'll probably have a real strong sense of this, which is where people aren't putting what might be the useful information to create a high value record. They're not actually writing it down. And so you get those situations where it's like, you could literally have a chat just start after a week of silence that just says, hey, don't worry about it. Andy's done it. And that's because a conversation has happened, face to face, or a conversation has happened in a different chat channel, or a conversation has happened during a meeting, and someone's just sort of followed up with someone, or perhaps even over email. Like I've had situations where people email each other and then they switch to chat from the email. And so saying, look, is it worth keeping these chats? I think one of the things we need to consider is how much of the useful context exists in what people have actually written down to actually make it worthwhile to keep it. Because if I can't tell you who Andy is, or if I can't tell you what Ed is working at those things, then basically that's diminishing the value of the record, or diminishing the reasons for keeping it. So then third thing there, the absolute classic, which I see all the time. It's a brilliant one in meeting chats. Surprised that it hasn't happened too much here yet, where people are just throwing in jokes, just having a laugh, and you've got something that you might consider of high value, but it's actually mixed in with just people just sort of, I'd say this in a very rude way, but I'll try not to, but having a laugh with each other, banter, that's probably a polite way to put it. And sometimes, it really would make it very hard to interpret what you've got. And I think, like I personally find that even over a period of weeks or months to look back at something and go, were they serious? Did they mean that? Like what? And imagine that we're going, oh, actually, I think this is a very serious business record and we need to retain this for 5 years. And we go back to that thing after 5 years and we try and look at that and we try and understand, what was the real intention here, or what were people really trying to get across? To me, that just seems, really risky, because it would be really, really easy to misinterpret what was there. Hard to manage, and this probably flows through to the points after it. So chats, there's this massive trend in digital communication where everything's getting more but smaller. So if you think of like emails used to be quite long. I remember when I first started doing emails in the 90s that, I'd basically treat them like a formal letter, dear mum, or, to who it may concern, blah, blah, blah. But we've moved more and more into, could just be a single word, could just be a smiley face, could just be, a GIF of SpongeBob SquarePants. And so what gets difficult about that in terms of managing stuff is I've talked to people, technology people, who've gone, look, there must be some way to kind of try and find the things that you care about. And even using the eDiscovery feature, okay, we're going to search on these particular words. And if you just get this 3-word chunk and it's got that keyword in it, what do you do next? Like, what's the bit that you want to keep? Do you want to keep 10 things before it and 10 things after it? Like, is that a good enough record? If it's a group chat and you've got 5 other people in the chat and they're talking at cross purposes about what they had for breakfast and whether they like chocolate cake or banana cake, like, do you try and filter that, or do you just go, oh, okay, we need 20 either side, we need 50 either side? Or, like, I think it gets really complicated because we're dealing with these tiny little fragments of content that are just being flicked around. And then to that last point, all we really know about each piece is kind of who it went to, who it was written by, and when it was sent. There is no kind of descriptive metadata, that's like, oh, this relates to this line of business, or these people at that time were in this team or had this role. Channel posts a little bit better, as I said right near the start. So if you're posting something in a team that's called, human resources, funnily enough, it's probably quite fair to say it's probably about human resources, but it's, still really, really blurry. So I think all of these things ought to come into our decision making. We should just kind of mull that one over. I'll just double check the chat. But I've got
Yeah, I was
some
going
other
to say, Alex has asked a question there, Michael.
Retaining before deleting, how long would you recommend? Yeah, it's a tricky one. So one large central government agency in New Zealand, like one of our biggest government agencies, has set it to 90 days, has set like a 3-month destruction rule. And their thinking on that, as far as I know, and I might be misrepresenting them, so maybe I'll just say what I reckon. What I think is that one of the benefits of doing that, provided you put really sort of clear guidance and clear sort of expectation setting around that, and perhaps even some alternatives if it's causing drama for people, is that you're really setting an expectation that this could never be used for record keeping, because it's just going to go. So don't get into a routine of relying on information that's going to be lost, or that is poorly described, or that is hard to understand later. Because I think there are some circumstances when people think, oh, I'll put this in writing so that, colleagues have this link or whatever. And I think there must be better options for that. There must be better ways to basically share knowledge and capture those kinds of relatively transient things. So I think going really short, provided you said so really clearly, and obviously you get buy-in all the way up the chain to agree that this is what you're doing, I think it sets a really clear expectation. Look, this is not for, you don't need to use these words, but basically for keeping records. This is not for keeping a record that you depend on and that you rely on and you need to go back to later. There is obvious risks around this, right? What are the risks in terms of deleting stuff? I guess that's one I wouldn't mind people here and commenting on. What are the risks if we do auto delete things? Assuming you're allowed to. Let's just assume that your jurisdiction, set up allows you to do it. It's scary to chuck that out there at that.
You can come off chat, or come off mute, or chuck it in the chat if you like to.
Fair enough. one of the things I do really like in the training courses, I'll say, is like typically we're quite small, you know, and so if you're sitting there with 5 other colleagues, it's great to be able to just throw the stuff around and have a bit of sort of Chatham House rules, not worry that you're saying something on behalf of your organisation. So I mean, well, I'll have a crack at answering that myself. So what could go wrong if you delete stuff? So an argued benefit of keeping these things is that you can catch wrongdoing. So that idea of sort of being able to investigate stuff, if someone's, you know, if someone's bullying someone else, and if that was something that was just happening sort of at a desk side thing, and suddenly that's in writing, you've got something, right? You've got additional evidence that you could use for that. Likewise, any other kind of misconduct or wrongdoing. So that could cause a lot of concern. And then the perhaps more sort of obvious and recordsy thing is that one of the risks. And I think it might be in the chat here. Destroying protected records would suck. Yeah, like the risk is, and I mean this is always a risk, is that people don't know when to create a good record, and they don't know where to put a good record, and so they think, oh look, this is fine, I'll just chuck things in here, and then all that information gets lost, or they and they do that because they don't know that it is important that they capture something somewhere else, and that can be referred to later. So yeah, so I think that is where policy really matters, and I think as a general point, I think if we get really involved in kind of setting clear expectations for within a specific business process, what's the kind of records you need? Like I think that would be, I think that would be the way that I would try and tackle that. But I mean, I'll be 100% honest, like none of these things is perfect, right? Like it's all about juggling risks. So one of the reasons I like the idea of a much shorter period than, for instance, 12 months is that I think it kind of drives that idea that, it's definitely not good for keeping records and tracking it later. And I guess, yeah, I'll pause there for a minute. But I guess another thing I would say about that kind of thing about catching wrongdoing and stuff is actually being clear for ourselves. Like, there are competing risks. There are definitely risks in retaining stuff. Like we all know that disposition is important and for good reasons, because you don't want this ever growing sort of stack of uncontrolled information. Creates bigger administrative burdens. It can expose your organisation to risks that it shouldn't be exposed to, and so forth. So so disposition is an important part of a record keeping or a records management jurisdictional framework for good reasons. But but with that in mind, if you, sorry, I'm finding it hard to get my head around how to say this one clearly. If you accept that back in the day, like rewind before Teams, rewind before pandemic and so forth, and people are at their desks and having chats, were they capturing the records that they should? And if they weren't, then that's the root problem. Like it's not the existence of chats, and it's not whether or not you delete the chats that I think is the root problem. The root problem is that you haven't got a culture of creating the right records. And so I think that's the thing that I would focus on. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say. Vander in the chat talking about context of what was said, who said it, and all of that stuff. Like this is absolutely true, unfortunately. So someone could say something that is actually really important, and that it is a more substantial record that ought to be kept. And this is part of the reality of managing information, is that any decision we make, like we will lose records, like we will destroy information, or we will have failed to have created records. And that is our operating environment. Like that's the reality for all of us. And so we have to be bold about what are the competing likelihoods and impacts, like risk management. That's how my brain works. It's like, what are the risks and what's which one matters most for my organization and why. Yeah. So that's just my big reckons. Yeah. And I'm just going to throw a completely different angle in on this, which I think is quite interesting. And that's this question. So I think it's really easy to jump to all these technical possibilities and like, oh, what if we configure our system so they do all these things? But also, I it's always true that, you know, if we need good records of what our organization has done, it doesn't matter if they were created by our staff, by employees, or whether they were created by a third party. We need to create and maintain those records, right? And so we have to think, well, what is it that we would ask a contractor to do? So would you talk to, I don't know, would you talk to your IT vendors about what they're doing in chat inside their own organizations? Would you talk to, you know, other kinds of suppliers? You know, if you had a outsourced legal contract or a cleaning contract, or I mean, that's probably going quite far because they might not create any substantial records, but you know what I mean? Like, I think I quite like this as a rule of thumb when I'm thinking about any kind of sort of novel kind of records is, oh, well, hang on, we have to cover contractors and third parties. Like, what would I say to them? So I'm interested in your thinking about that. Like, where's your point of focus there if you're talking to a third party? Is it about what they do in the chat, or is it something else? That's kind of where I'd got to really in terms of what I was going to present today. I guess the thing that I would emphasize about all of this is, in just sort of summary, like things you can do. You can set a thing that will prevent destruction of chats. You can set something that will auto delete those chats after a certain period of time. And you can configure that based on users, or you can configure that based on teams. This is called retention policy. It's in the Purview admin center. And yeah, in my opinion, is not really a practical way to sort the wheat from the chaff, being you know, that thing of trying to identify high value information and then retain that. So I would be looking for a solution that's appropriate for my organization and its risk appetite, that basically tries to balance those competing risks of if we auto delete stuff, then we might lose information that we needed, and you know, and that could undermine how it work in any, you know, many different ways, including a compliance failure. Or on the flip side, if we keep everything, are we creating this kind of ever-growing burden for ourselves that we can't do anything about? Or, you know, basically it's just going to slow our organisation down under sort of the administrative weight, people having to sift through it all every time we get a request. Yeah. So I'd be really keen to hear any other thoughts or comments.
There's a few in the chat there, Michael, from Xandra, from Mel.
Your own group is the one responsible for capturing records within it. Oh, that's quite awesome. I like it. I like it. So you're basically saying, look, part of that owner role, I suppose, is that you identify what's of importance and write it down. Yeah. Yeah, I think I sounds great to me. Sounds really good. And actually, one thing that jumps out for me about that is that a whole lot of these kinds of questions already came up years ago to do with email, but there's a bunch of stuff that technically I think makes basically makes teams worse quality records because of that kind of how bitsy it is and how it's used, and just what it's intended for. I think makes it worse than email. But that kind of an idea of like giving someone responsibility, yeah, really makes sense. Yeah. And likewise, Mel's idea there, basically another practical tip of being able to basically send to Outlook. So you can choose the three dots at the end of a Teams message and punt that somewhere else. Yeah, that's quite a good one. Yeah, nice one. And I suppose with my rhetorical question around contractors, that really, this idea that like basically if someone makes a call, you identify that, you know, the chat wasn't the right place to create that record, and you do something next. You know, you do something more to actually go and create a record. I think that's that for me is a practical solution. Yeah. I guess in terms of LTD's courses, this really lines up with the Records Management 365 course, and you know, I find that a really enjoyable one to kind of try and work through, like, how do you do this stuff? Because it's such a broad scope of information in 365, and so it's a great opportunity to try and sort of apply some controls that wouldn't exist in EDRMs. Or identify when actually no, we've hit a limit here and we want to go put something into EDRMs.
We have a new Microsoft Teams workshop that's being rolled out at the moment. It doesn't go into detail on how to achieve the ultimate governance, but it will cover basics of Teams and an overview of governance capabilities. Our new workshops are 2 hours long, that's all. So we're just a quick snapshot, and then it will flow into our All You Need to Know courses. So jump online, have a look, give me a call or reach out. But I just want to say again, Michael, you're amazing. We love you here at LTD. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you everybody for participating today and coming along for the chat. Any questions or anything like that, you can shoot them over to me. Either give me a call or drop me an email. And again, thank you all for your time. We really appreciate it. All right.
Fine. Thanks all.
See you later.
See ya.
Thank you.